Yeah, more or less, because the job came up at Honest de Poort, and I just finished studying overseas, and my supervisor there, I asked him, does he think there's a good future in foot and mouth disease research? And he said, no, that problem's solved. It's a forgotten problem. You'll be redundant before you know it. But anyway, because it was more money, I decided to take it. And then I've been busy for 40 years. So well, it's feared because of its international reputation. In other parts of the world, foot and mouth disease is a rapidly spreading, highly transmissible and contagious disease, and it affects a large number of animals in a short period of time. And although it doesn't kill many of them, it affects their productivity severely. Over and above that, there are many variants of the virus. So cattle or livestock can suffer repeated outbreaks, one after the other, and that makes livestock production uneconomic. And for that reason, it got this terrible reputation, and that's why everybody is keen to eradicate it. That's exactly the point that we're facing here in Southern Africa, because here the disease is actually very mild. It's a trivial disease, in fact. Very few animals get seriously sick. A large number of them don't get sick at all. In other words, it's very like COVID-19, where it's characterized by, in most cases, mild disease or no disease at all, and therefore its direct effects are very little. The problem is that because the rest of the world considers it so important, if you announce that you've got foot and mouth disease, it's considered a catastrophe, and nobody wants to trade with you. And that's the real problem that we face here in Southern Africa. In most parts of the world, especially where they have experience of it in historical times, like Europe and North America, they just found it terribly difficult to deal with, and therefore they were able to eradicate it. But the point is that the type of foot and mouth disease that they have in those parts of the world is very different from the foot and mouth that we have here. And therefore, to eradicate the disease in our part of the world, because mainly of the wildlife involvement, but there are other reasons as well, that is really impossible. So we have the problem that other parts of the world say, well, if you've still got a foot and mouth problem, there's something wrong with you and what you're doing. They don't understand that maybe our problem is different and therefore needs to be approached differently. Well, in our part of the world, it is essentially very much a man-made plague. The reason is that the measures that are prescribed internationally for control of foot and mouth disease, which involve slaughter out of animals, trade standstills, and things like that, have severe economic impact. So when we have an outbreak of foot and mouth disease in this part of the world, the direct effects of the disease are very minimal. But the indirect effects on trade, on intensive livestock production systems, and so on, it's very severe. So in contrast to the other parts of the world where the direct effects are severe, here the direct effects aren't severe, but the indirect effects are massive. The foot and mouth disease we have here is caused by a branch of foot and mouth disease viruses that in fact was the original foot and mouth disease virus, which evolved in Africa with African buffalo. And it's been here perhaps up to 1,000 years ago, but for many centuries it's been here in buffalo. And when cattle come into contact with buffalo, sometimes, not always, cattle become infected. But as I say, it's a relatively mild disease, so the outbreaks actually more or less cure themselves in most instances. The other branch of foot and mouth disease, which split some hundreds of years ago from what are known as the SAT serotypes, these, as far as we know, evolved around the Mediterranean, but in association with livestock, not wildlife. And these then spread back into Africa later. That type of foot and mouth disease causes the classic foot and mouth disease that the rest of the world deals with. The SAT viruses have always been here, but they behave very differently, especially with respect to their relationship with wildlife. But there are other epidemiological and virological differences between these two viruses, these two branches of foot and mouth disease virus. That's why people like me maintain that the way you control these two different types of disease needs to be different, and that the rest of the world hasn't understood yet. It's not that they don't know about it, because the information is in the scientific literature. But for reasons which I certainly don't understand, the international organizations seem to be disinclined to accept that there are these differences. And what they tried to propose is that a one-size-fits-all is the way forward. And I personally disagree with that 100%. The control measures that are laid down in the standards of the World Organization for Animal Health and the recommendations which they make are complex. And, but they essentially require draconian measures to handle outbreaks of foot and mouth disease. In other words, you can stop all movement of animals, stop all trade, slaughter out animals on a large scale. That is okay if you were in Europe or North America, perhaps, although I doubt in North America. But in our part of the world, if you try and apply those types of measures in our environment, they're, number one, unacceptable to the farmers and the other livestock owners in those areas, and are in fact unnecessary. So they're just inappropriate. One of the recommendations of the OIE, for example, for managing foot and mouth disease is creation of foot and mouth disease-free zones. And this has been done in a number of countries in Southern Africa, countries like Botswana, Namibia, South Africa, and Zimbabwe. So 20 years ago, those 4 countries had large foot and mouth disease-free zones from which buffalo were excluded, they were fenced off, and there were measures in place to stop foot and mouth disease entering. These fencing systems had a tremendous impact on wildlife because they blocked migration routes, access to grazing, access to water, and so indirectly they decimated wildlife populations in this part of the world. However, the zones for some countries have worked and are of benefit. Those, for example, are Botswana and Namibia. However, in the last 20 years, South Africa has lost recognition of its foot and mouth disease-free zone 3 times, and Zimbabwe has totally lost recognition of its foot and mouth disease-free zone. So creation of these free zones has tremendous impacts when the economic and environmental. The benefits are sure, because you're able to trade, but the surrounding communities and farming communities don't benefit at all, and so you produce a two-tier system in countries. So some producers benefit and others are losers. And this whole system, because of the socio-economic, environmental effects, there's been no new foot-and-mouth disease-free zone created in Southern Africa in the last 40 years. So this is held up as the solution for the future. But despite a number of countries in Southern Africa trying to do this, not one of them has succeeded. And what we are learning now, especially here in South Africa, is that to maintain these foot-and-mouth disease-free zones is increasingly difficult. One of the problems that we have in Southern Africa, particularly with the development of the transfrontier conservation concept, which is, as far as wildlife conservation is concerned, it's a tremendous progress. But populations, rural cattle-owning communities, small-scale producers in those areas find it very difficult to have a positive attitude towards wildlife conservation because their cattle have a lower value than cattle in foot-and-mouth disease-free zones, for example. So they want to also be in the foot-and-mouth disease-free zone. So at the moment, certainly in South Africa, we have a two-tier system. In the endemic areas around the Kruger National Park, cattle have a lower value than in the rest of the country. And therefore, communities there are not positive quite often in respect of wildlife conservation. However, there are very interesting initiatives whereby a number of organizations are developing measures that indirectly benefit those small-scale farmers. And if small-scale farmers can benefit directly from conservation initiatives, that will change their whole attitude. And if the people living in an area are not supportive of conservation, it will never be successful in the long run. I remember, I think it was around 40 years ago, there was a foot-and-mouth outbreak at Guyana. So I got in my car and I went there. And the vet in charge of the outbreak, I was a recent graduate, and one of my classmates was in charge. And he came up to me and he said, "I've got the headman here and the chief, and they're complaining to me. They're saying, you know, last year when our cattle were dying of red water, you guys were not interested. Now we have foot-and-mouth disease. Our animals have a few lesions in their mouth and on their feet, but you and I know next week they're going to be better, and this whole thing will peter out. Why are you so worried about this disease that doesn't kill any of our animals, but you ignore completely our problem with red water?" So this colleague of mine came up to me and he said, "How do I explain to this gentleman that the international beef business is the cause of this problem?" There's little doubt that if attitudes change and in a positive direction. There's no doubt that, for instance, in South Africa, that the small-scale producers and the large-scale producers can integrate their systems much better than they have in the past, and it will be to the benefit of both. No, with the present technologies that are available, the SAT serotype foot and mouth disease that's associated with wildlife in this part of the world would be very difficult to eradicate. In fact, we have published papers showing that it's impossible. So you have to come up with another plan. But because this is such a mild disease and it spreads very slowly, there are many ways of actually managing foot and mouth disease quite effectively, which do not require geographic separation. So if we just use the scientific information that is available, what we understand about the environment which we've got to apply this into, we can come up with quite sensible solutions. One of these solutions is a concept known as commodity-based trade. Now, commodity-based trade simply implies that what you can do is, through the production process of beef or milk or cheese or butter or whatever it is, you can apply measures that even if the locality is infected, the product itself is perfectly safe. This can be, this is scientifically justifiable and enables trade to take place in an environment where you cannot get rid of the disease absolutely. Meat can transmit foot and mouth disease. That is a possibility, and in historical times that happened. What happened, for example, in Europe many decades ago was that every household had a pig in the back garden that fed the kitchen scraps. And often those scraps contained bits of meat which had foot and mouth disease virus in it, and this kept the foot and mouth disease going and seeded the virus into the farming livestock populations. But actually beef is a very safe product because even in infected animals, there's very little virus, if any, in meat. The second thing is that when animals are slaughtered, as a natural physiological consequence, the glycogen in the muscle gets broken down. And one of the byproducts of that breakdown is the formation of lactic acid. And that lactic acid makes normal meat, which we buy in the butcher's shop, acidic. And one of the characteristics of foot and mouth disease virus is that it's highly sensitive to acid environments. So even though in the first place there's little if any virus in meat, but the pH, the low pH, destroys the virus which can be there. And therefore this is an accepted international way of trading meat. The unfortunate thing is that foot and mouth disease in the big wide world is overhyped, and so many powerful countries just say, look, if you've got foot and mouth in your country, we don't want to trade with you. Don't matter what you do, we just don't want your stuff. My colleagues and I think that this is probably a multifactorial situation. There are various factors, animal population dynamics, the behavior of people in rural areas, but of course also there have been increasing numbers of livestock in rural areas. And although generally wildlife conservation has suffered, wildlife populations have declined in the recent past in general, but in some parts of southern Africa that's not the case. And there are also, at the same time, initiatives that are aimed at improving wildlife conservation and protecting wildlife populations. And these measures, particularly the Trans-Frontier Conservation Area, depend on establishing connectivity between populations, because then you have healthy gene flows and the populations can remain healthy. If you isolate populations, the opposite happens. So the control measures for foot and mouth disease and diseases like it, and the principles on which conservation is built, are clash. They're contradictory. So we have to find a way to accommodate, because wildlife conservation is very, very important for Southern Africa, because it's one of our unique natural resources. Nowhere else in the world has got that. Many other parts of the world have got plenty of livestock as well. We have no real competitive advantage when it comes to livestock production. But livestock production is, of course, important for many people in this part of the world. So it's important, but wildlife conservation is too. So what we have to find is a way in which these two competing objectives can be accommodated. And there are ways in which this can be done. In my opinion, the first thing we've got to do is make sure that the stakeholders in Southern Africa, that's small-scale producers, large-scale producers, the animal industries, the veterinary services, the whole setup needs to accept the realities ourselves. I know from many years of going around Southern Africa that there are many vets in the field who believe foot and mouth disease is an eradicable disease. They say it's been eradicated in Europe and North America. If they can eradicate it, we can eradicate it. But they don't understand that the type of foot and mouth disease we're dealing with here is completely different. So what has been done in Europe and North America is one thing. What can be done here is another. So we all ourselves collectively have to understand the problem and the potential solutions. Only once we have absorbed that ourselves and practice it can we sell it to people on the outside. So that's the way we need to go. We have to control foot and mouth disease better than we have done now. And in my opinion, there are two crucial technical elements that are required for that. The first is better vaccines and vaccination programs. I'm not saying that the current vaccines are no good. They obviously work in some situations, not so well in others. But precisely why that is, we really don't know. So there's got to be a lot more research going into improving foot and mouth disease vaccines. And there are a number of initiatives which are very promising and which I think might provide the solution on that respect. The second is that because foot and mouth disease in this part of the world is such a mild disease and it produces a proportion of subclinical infections, in other words, animals don't show any signs of disease, one doesn't know where it is and where it isn't. If you don't know where the disease is and isn't, you cannot really effectively control any contagious disease. So just like the COVID-19, what we need is rapid testing systems to detect infection. If you have that, then you can manage the disease much more effectively. So if we had a combination between better vaccines and rapid testing systems, we would solve, I don't say we would solve the foot and mouth disease the problem completely, but we'd go a long way towards that. Since the late 1970s, vaccination against foot and mouth disease has been widely used throughout southern Africa. Interestingly enough, for the first 20 years, it worked very well. But up to about 2000, there were very few, between the late 1970s and 2000, there were very few outbreaks of foot and mouth disease in southern Africa. But something happened in about 2000. And for the last 20 years, the rate at which foot and mouth disease outbreaks are occurring in our part of the world has gone up exponentially. So the vaccination programs appear not to be working nearly as well as they did in the past. The problem is nobody has thought of investigating independently why this has happened. Various people have ideas, and there are a number of technical issues which can explain the problem, but there has been no concentrated effort in understanding the problem so that it can be solved. Yes, well, unfortunately, this is another one of these misconceptions, because a lot of countries consider meat derived from countries where vaccination is practiced to be potentially dangerous. The idea is that vaccination could somehow hide the infection. But the evidence is that, as I've already explained, because of the fact that even in infected animals, whether they're vaccinated or not, there's very little virus in beef, certainly, and the little virus that is there is inactivated by the acidic environment. There's no reason why, whether the animals are vaccinated or not, perfectly safe beef cannot be produced. Well, for South Africa to get out of the present situation is not easy. I have recently written a monograph in which I have explained how I think the problem should be addressed. There are a whole bunch of things which need to be done, both so far as infrastructure improvement and is concerned, as well as reducing the dangerous animal practices which we have in the country. For example, we need to be able to identify individual cattle much more accurately than we currently do. So there are a whole series of steps which are necessary. Because even if South Africa got its foot and mouth disease-free status back from the OIE tomorrow, we know from the history of the last 20 years that it won't be long before we have another one. And so we land back in the same position. So not only have we got to persuade the OIE that we deserve to be recognized as a country free of foot and mouth disease, but we also have to put in measures to ensure that we don't have a repeat performance. And that is not easy, and it will take time and investment. The answer is to apply these non-geographic measures to reduce the risk of foot and mouth disease infection being maintained and spread from wildlife to livestock, without having to necessarily geographically separate populations. So we need, for example, better vaccines. That's being worked on. We need, just like the COVID, the problem with the SAT virus is nobody knows where it is and where it isn't, because there's animals being infected, but they don't show any signs of it. So you have to have the same rapid testing systems that is being developed for COVID-19. If we had those, we can handle the situation much better. I think the general consensus is that if we don't control foot and mouth disease much more effectively than we have done in the last 20 years, livestock production or cloven-hoofed livestock production in Southern Africa, and South Africa particularly, has got a very poor future. And it would also mean that healthy rural development for South Africa becomes a lottery. It's just up for grabs. It's much better to have a plan and implement a plan based on sound scientific principles than to have nothing. Well, at a technical level, what we know about foot and mouth disease in comparison with what we knew 40 years ago is tremendous improvement. We know a lot of technical stuff. But if we're honest, those technical improvements haven't really led to any better improvement in our performance in managing foot and mouth disease. And I think this is largely because research, particularly in more recent time, has become very compartmentalized. So you get experts on very narrow fields, but you've got very few people who understand the problem holistically. And I think the holistic understanding of the problem has to be concentrated on more than has been the case in the past. We've tended to focus on small technical issues, which in the end don't make that much difference. I've been involved in foot and mouth disease in not only in Southern Africa but in other parts of Africa, in Asia, India, Pakistan, Mongolia. I've had a little experience in the Americas, but not much. But foot and mouth disease in different parts of the world is actually very different. And I think that one of the big problems is that there's this idea that foot and mouth disease is a disease which presents in a similar way in all parts of the world. Actually, it's very different in different parts of the world, but that is particularly so in Southern Africa. Southern Africa is unique.